So for those of you who aren't familiar with Tom, this is Tom Das, and he's also a teacher based here in the UK and gives regular satsangs in Kingston. And we've done a couple of joint talks now. This is the third one we've done together. We have, in a way, similar understanding, I believe. We both value the intellect in the process. And when I first came across Tom, it was because I was going to do an interview on Buddha at the gas pump, and I thought I'd better see what the interviewer is like. And the last recorded interview was Tom's. So I said, I'll listen to this one. And when I was hearing him, I said, well, he's applying the same critical thinking to his teaching that I value so much. And so somehow we got in contact. I must have sent a message. And I feel that we're very complementary, even though the styles are different. They're not the same. But I feel that the experience is the same. The understanding of how the process works is the same. And so, you know, this is an opportunity. I guess we haven't planned on how it's going to work. I think it's a great opportunity for you guys to ask questions, and I thought that I'd suggest a theme, and that theme could be common misconceptions in teachings. So if you have, and this fits into the theme, a question was asked, what does it mean, so this was before you arrived, this lovely lady asked, what does it mean that Nirvana and Samsara are said to arise in the mind? So I thought that could be...
Oh, thanks, yeah. Let's get straight to the technical stuff.
Yeah.
2 nice Sanskrit words or Pali words to get us started.
Yeah. So this isn't necessarily a misconception. This would be someone who, let's say, says, I'd like some clarity on this. So I think Tom would answer that. But there are some other things that are misconceptions, like, for example, the notion of no mind. We sometimes think that no mind means all thoughts will fall away forever. So that's something I could talk about as a common misconception. So maybe we keep it in that theme. You happy?
Yeah,
Does
absolutely.
That sound
that
good?
Sounds fine to me. Well,
okay, so there you go. There's the question. No, the Samsara and Nirvana.
The Samsara and Nirvana. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for welcoming me here. And thanks, Roger, for the introduction. I'm just trying to stall and think about the question. Well, actually, it's interesting when it comes to answering questions like, you know, Nirvana, Samsara, they arise in the mind. Why is that? Personally, I don't think there's one set answer. There are different ways of answering the question. It depends how you use the words. It depends where the seeker's at and how there's a communication between the teacher, the seeker. As if there's a difference. You know, we pretend sometimes pretend there's a difference between a seeker and a teacher, and there isn't. Now that's a part of the illusion. That's samsara. I mean, you could say samsara is when you believe that you're someone here and there's a teacher over there, or there's something over here and there's something over there, and there isn't something over here and something over there. That's called samsara, if you believe that. And nirvana, you could say, is when that belief isn't there. There isn't that belief in separation. You could say that's nirvana. So now you've got a concept of freedom, nirvana, and you've got a concept of bondage or suffering, samsara. Right? That's kind of the way a very traditional Buddhist might talk about it. When I say very traditional, I'm talking about these sort of earlier Buddhist schools that stem from the Pali texts. I don't want to get too technical because I don't know what this audience is like in terms of Buddhism and things. And I studied Buddhism from, I read a lot of the texts for many years and things. But in the Pali text, in the Pali suttas, it talks about Samsara and Nirvana. Nirvana is freedom. And Nirvana means, well, you can't put it into words. But then another wave of Buddhist teachings came along a few hundred years later, what we now call the Mahayana. And they talked about how both Nirvana and Samsara were actually, if you're caught up in those concepts, you see, of Nirvana, of freedom, and of Samsara, of suffering, of bondage, of illusion, of ignorance, then that itself is a form of dogma. You see, freedom is a concept, and ignorance is a concept. So they're both ideas born of ignorance. And in that sense, the reality, the Buddha nature, the Mahayana teachings talk about, the Buddha nature, transcends both samsara and nirvana. So it depends what paradigm you're talking about. Have I confused people though? I don't know. I always, good. People, what, have I? Anyone thinking, what on earth is going on with something? Okay. So that's the work so actually you'll find when you look at the earlier Buddhist teachings based on the Pali texts, the only kind of Buddhist school we've really got left is the Tera Vaada Buddhist school, which is sort of, Tera Vaada literally means school of the elders. And it's the kind of oldest current Buddhist tradition that we have that's still going today. But at the times of the Buddha, there were many, many different forms of Buddhism around. We know that from the scriptures. We know that from the texts. And Tera Vaada is just one of them that came along. It's one of the early schools of Buddhism. And in that early school of Buddhism, they talk about samsara as being suffering and illusion, and believing there's a me, and believing there's a path, and believing there's a teacher. And then nirvana is you can't talk about it in words. And then people started making a dogma out of this. Can you imagine human beings making a dogma out of spiritual teachings? No. And I know it's difficult to imagine, but just imagine that this becomes now a belief system. So a few hundred years later, Mahayana people came along and said, you know what, you're just caught up in beliefs. What we're talking about is beyond both samsara and nirvana. Samsara and nirvana are both in your mind. And you'll find this in teachings. You'll say, the highest truth is Brahman. In the Vedic scriptures, the highest truth is Brahman. Everything is Brahman, the absolutes, the unconditioned. Pure Sat, Chit, Ananda. Pure being, consciousness, bliss. And then another teacher will go, no, it's not about Brahman. You've made that into a concept. It's Parabrahman. Parabrahman's where it's at. It's not consciousness. It's prior to consciousness. And you see this in Nisargadatta Maharaj's lineage, in his sampradaya, in his lineage. They talk about how people get stuck onto concepts of Brahman. And there's one of these major books in his lineage called Das Bodh. And Das Bodh talks about how we're so easily caught up in concepts and we start believing, oh, there's no one here, there's no one here, there's no one here, there's no one here. That's the concept now. It's all about non-duality. That's the concept now. Oh, it's nirvana. So eventually another teaching comes along and says, no, that too is of the mind. And if we make that into a new teaching, well, then we remain stuck in their mind. The mind's a wonderful tool. As Roger alluded to, I value the use of the mind provisionally in these teachings. And then you discover that which is beyond the mind.
The teachings are also absorbed by the mind. So everything that's separate.
Can you just use the microphone? Yeah.
So the so-called separate entity.
Sorry to harbour the point. Is the green light on? Yeah, and just. Yeah.
So the so-called separate entity who's caught up in the world, who's the seeker, has all this energy, going on, related to the individual. But then the teaching also comes in, and the teaching is also absorbed by the mind. So, so I think my question was more of how, but it's, the teaching is absorbed by the mind, but then the ultimate thing is transcending the mind.
Yeah.
So, so the mind, as
I'll give you an example then. Do you mind if I interrupt? And you can always come back if I have sort of, not answered what you're trying to get at. But yeah, the teaching comes in through the mind often. It doesn't have to, by the way. The teaching can be non-verbal as well. But a way the teaching commonly comes through is through the mind. But as I said, and many of us would have had experiences, maybe just suddenly something comes to us. We're not sure how. That's a teaching. And that hasn't necessarily entered in through the cognitive apparatus, which we call the mind.
Right.
But of course, here in satsang, there are words being communicated. There's information being exchanged. Information's come from over there to here, and that's created a response here. And now there's information coming out over here. It's a spontaneous process. There's no separation. But say you've never seen the sky before. You've never seen the sky before. You're walking around. You're like, "Where's the sky? I really want to find the sky. I've heard it's amazing." And then an amazing teacher like Tom comes along and says, "You know what? I've seen the sky. It's amazing." And I give you some directions. I say, "Look, stop looking around down here all the time. Stop being focused on where you're walking. Just stop walking and look up." So what's happened there is that information has been exchanged on the level of the mind. Correct?
Right, yeah.
And then you look up and you see the splendor of the sky, the vast open spaciousness. And you have your own experience. The sky was always here. In this metaphor, in this analogy, we're pointing to something that's always available. So in this analogy, the sky's always been fully present here. And so when we see it, suddenly there was a teaching that helped us come to an insight. It was a catalyst. Did Tom give you the sky? Yes, he did in a way, because maybe without those specific words, that specific time, you wouldn't never have seen the sky, or you'd have seen the sky 5 years later, or you'd have had to trip over a stone on the road, land, and then as you look up, you see, maybe there are lots of different ways you could have seen the sky.
So that, just to add, that's an example of how the teaching came in through the mind, and then allowed you to transcend the mind to see beyond the teaching. See that, and then you might what would be an example of where the pointer is delivered to the mind, and it gets caught in the mind instead.
Yeah. So an example of that. Try and keep it quite simple.
I think we can keep. Can we keep the same example of?
Yeah, sure.
The sky, I think.
Yeah, and do keep me on track because I can. It's good. Roger's reining me in. So, for example, if I said, stop what you're doing, don't pay too much attention to where you're walking, just stop and look up, and that's the instruction. So that's the teaching. And say instead of looking up, stopping and looking up, you just carry on looking around. But now you're like, okay, I've got the teachings now. It's stop walking, stop looking at my feet and look up. Stop walking, look at my feet and walk up. And then someone else comes to you, they also can't see the sky. And then you start talking about the teaching. Someone else says, oh no, the teaching is sit down, lie on your back. Yeah? That's what they've heard, how to look at the sky. And you're like, no, it's not sit down, look at your back. It's stop, walk on your feet and look up. You see? And then they have an argument about that. You see?
And then another teaching comes and says, it's about you drop all of that.
Yeah. It's not about the mind. Yeah. And no, it's about the mind, because Tom said the teaching's going through the mind. Mm-hmm. Do you see?
Yeah, that kind of makes sense, because you brought up this thing about the teaching coming in other ways.
Yeah.
Rather than the mind, and that's that really brought the point home. It's the understanding. Sometimes you just don't know where that understanding came from. It's beyond the mind. I guess that's how Ramana's teachings were through silence. So yeah, that was a really good answer. Thank you.
Oh, that's good.
Thank you, Roger, as well.
No, that's fine. I feel like I cut you off because there was probably more you were going to say.
Oh, probably.
I don't know if you remember where you were, but it's because you were talking about the original Buddhist teachings, and then they get caught in as they become doctrine, and so they've failed. The teaching hasn't failed, but the way that the individual has related to the teaching was once again to turn it into looking for something with the mind, whereas it was actually getting us to stop and look outside. It basically telling us to stop the thinking of the mind, and we carry on thinking. And so then another teaching comes along and tries to counter that problem. And we've seen this a lot. A recent example that I heard was someone said to me, a very well-known teacher is saying, what is it that is witnessing the witness? And I said, well, nothing witnesses the witness. I said, you must have misunderstood what he said, because in my experience, there isn't anything that witnesses the witness. She said, he's definitely giving instruction, what witnesses the witness? And so she showed a clip, and it dawned on me what's happened is he was talking about the real witnessing, let's say, trying to bring about a shift, which is not something that the individual does, it's just the stopping of the habituated thinking. And because of the feedback he's getting, what he's seeing in front of him, in the student's response, it's like, they're caught in trying to do witnessing. The person is trying to do witnessing, which is not what he was originally, when just allow witnessing to happen. And then it's, okay, so now the individual is doing witnessing, that's observing in a sense. So okay, now what witnesses what the student is now thinking is witnessing, whereas it's just observing. So now what witnesses the witness, to try and bring this shift back? So technically we could say there is nothing that witnesses the witness, but this is to deal with a problem. But we can see where a lot of problems happen from this notion of taking pointers and intellectualizing them too much, or not necessarily intellectualizing, but not being ready to receive them in a way that just delivers the final blow. Do you remember where you were? Because we can carry it on if...
Yeah, I could. Well, I mean, I was wondering if the questioner, sorry, I don't know your name. What's your name? Samira. I don't know if you want to... Mira. Oh, sorry, Mira. I don't know if you want to come back on... Because what I like to do is... The point of... From my point of view, the point of me saying something and communicating something is so there's an actual understanding that's communicated. So where are you with that answer? And does that make sense to you? Is that okay, Roger?
Yeah. It is. I have... Yeah, go ahead. I think that's great. We need to answer the question.
I just find, what you said about getting confused and about the example about the witnessing. I mean, I get confused a lot, but I think that's a useful thing, because getting confused means that somewhere along the line there will be an answer. I find the answer comes.
Yeah, the teachings will keep.
Which is great, because the clarity is. If there was no confusion, there probably would have not been that much clarity at the end of it. So I don't necessarily see that confusion as a bad thing. That gives an opportunity, for me to ask questions and sort of get a wider perspective on it.
Yeah, confusion's good because it means there's room for improvement, right? Is that what you're saying?
Confusion starts because there's ignorance there.
Yeah.
There's something, again, it's the mind, trying to grasp something that's totally non-objective. Mm-hmm. But that's happening. I'm not in control of it. No one's in control of it. So, but I'm not in control of myself. But
I'd like to, yeah.
But that's the space. I can see the space between, the constricted energy. There's a space that's appearing, in sort of the confusion leads to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a good thing actually to have that confusion.
Confusion leads to clarity. Let's say that. Yeah.
And Roger, what I was going to talk about was sort of the three main stages in which a teaching works in like Vedanta and Buddhist teachings in terms of listening, reflecting. Mm-hmm. That's where I was going to go with it.
Okay. So
I don't know if you want me to.
I think that's very interesting because it talks about stages of teachings, which are very valuable to hear because sometimes we're not really familiar or aware of what a teaching is doing and how it's coming about. But I was interested in putting forward an answer relative to the framework I put out this morning in relation to your question of what does it mean that samsara and nirvana arise or exist in the mind. And we've also heard heaven and earth are not out there. Heaven and hell are not out there, but they're here on earth. And when we look at liberation according to the definition I put forward, the end of suffering, and what is suffering? Suffering is our attitude to pleasure or pain, an attitude that says, I need life to be different, I need the other to have done things differently, they're not good enough, and I need it to function. So all of that suffering is generated on the level of thought. So samsara, which is the experience, including suffering, bondage, is essentially mind-made. And the opposite of that is the falling away of a mind-made content. So samsara is the absence or a quiet mind. So both nirvana and samsara are directly related to the activity of the mind. The samsara, we would say, is when the mind quietens down, something else.
Nirvana.
Nirvana? Did I say samsara? Nirvana. When the mind quietens down, a revelation of something prior to mind is revealed. And so nirvana is the combination of the absence of mind and the connection or the revelation of the essence that is and always has been complete. So that's, to me, that's my answer relative to the question of why it's said that nirvana, so it's a suffering, samsara, suffering, is mind-made. So suffering is actually in the mind. Circumstance is, suffering is the attitudinal. Peace is the absence of suffering. So it also, you could say, is related to mind.
I've got another question, again related to some esoteric teachings. So, I've sort of come into contact with the classic Upanishads, the Vedanta teachings, Aparakshana Bodhi, and I've sort of read a bit about it as well. So there's these diagrams of, basically of the gross, the physical body, the subtle body, and that kind of increases the clarity. But then the mind says, is this the way to go? And because all along it's just been like Roger's teachings and all the spiritual teachers, found that really, really helpful. But now is this sort of the mind's now just going towards all these sort of the scriptures and things. What value does it have? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah,
so this leads right into what you were going to talk about originally.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I think what's valuable is what works for you. And we don't know what will work for us. And we can only follow our hearts, our minds, where they lead us. And the fact that it sounds like you've got already an interest, maybe a passion for the classical scriptures, as do I. The wonderful thing about the Vedanta scriptures is, they're beautiful, they're sublime. The Upanishads, a text like Aparokshana which is written by Sri Shankaracharya. Interestingly, that Aparokshana one translation of that text is the the direct intimacy of experience. That's what that Sanskrit word means. The intimacy of experience. That's what they're talking about. It's a beautiful text. And these texts have aspects of complete teaching within them. So it's not just one person has an awakening and says, all right, this is how I think it is, and another person has an awakening, oh, this is how I think it is. It's over decades, over centuries, these scriptures have been produced, and they take in a whole variety of spiritual experience and produce a complete teaching. They teach us all the problems that come across in our path and how not to fall into them. And you get that in the Buddhist scriptures, you get that in the Hindu scriptures. Because they have that wealth of experience. They've seen lots of seekers take wrong turns. They've seen seekers have premature awakenings and think it's full enlightenment. And they can point out to you where you go wrong. So if you're into the classics, I think it's invaluable. But it's not for everyone. They can be very technical. It can get very intellectual. There's a language barrier. These are written in what for most people is a foreign language. And also there's a whole time discrepancy. I mean, Aparakshana was written about 1400 years ago. You know, if anyone's read Shakespeare, which is 400 years old, you can see the differences. Imagine the cultural differences in 1400 years. So it's always good to have a living teacher who understands the scriptures, if possible.
I've just read. I've been watching Swami Sarvapriyananda's the Vivekananda Order. His translations are just absolutely brilliant, and it's just so you can relate to it. You know, there's nothing ancient, or it's just in your. I find that it's what you say is really in my experience. So there's nothing sort of, you know, mystical. It's just so straightforward, and I just the clarity is really great. You know, but I don't know Sanskrit, so I wouldn't be able to sort of read the original scriptures or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's wonderful stuff in there. So I'll talk about two things. One of the things they do in classical texts often is that you get a whole metaphysical breakdown, cosmological breakdown of the makeup of the universe, okay? Which can be a bit tiresome and outdated, but has its use nonetheless. So they'll talk about the elements like earth, fire, water, ether, and the such, and how they combine, and the energies, and all this stuff. They'll talk about how the body functions, the energy in the body, the prana, the energy flows in the body, how the different aspects of the mind, the idea of the doer, the idea of the thinker, the intellect, and they'll explain how these different functions work. And some of us will be really drawn to that. We'll think, yeah, I really want to understand how all this stuff works. And others of us will think, this is just, I'm not really interested in this. And so that was one of your questions, I think, was, is it worth going down that route, learning all that stuff? There's a whole classification system in Vedanta. It's slightly different in Buddhism, and in different schools of Buddhism, they'll have it slightly differently. And, get this, they all argue amongst each other about which one's right, and they have done for centuries. Yes, this is all not beautiful. It's not just all beautiful stuff. It's also people arguing how the water element combines with the earth element to make, you know, a passionate type energy manifest in a part of the mind. They'll argue about it for, like, you know, a few centuries. There's a lot of that. The scriptures do point out that you don't need to go down all this stuff, only as much as you want to and need to. The idea is to realize that all these things come and go, and to understand the teachings and coming in through the mind, the verbal teachings coming in through the mind, and see how that process works. Okay? And that's all you need to understand. You don't need to understand all the detail stuff. You don't need to get caught up in all the stuff. Ramana Maharishi said, when you're throwing out the garbage, do you need to classify it first? He was in a pre-recycling age, don't forget. Yeah? Before some of our Hampstead locals get a bit cheeky with me. You're throwing out the garbage. Do you need to sort through it and classify it first? He goes, don't worry about all the classification systems. The tattvas, they're called, you know? Unless you feel like you need to learn a bit more about it, in which case that's what they're there for. They're there for you. But you don't need all that stuff. You don't need too much of that stuff. Just as much as you need. A teacher can help you with that. I was going to come on to the basic ways that these teachings work. And I hope I can make this quite practical. And again, do rein me in. But there's sort of 3 or 4 stages to the teaching. And these stages of the teaching are illusory, meaning when you look back on them, you realize it wasn't real in the first place. But because the teaching starts from a standpoint of a seeker suffering, in ignorance, not understanding the reality, the teachings come down to that level. And say, okay, you're a person, I'm a teacher, there's a teaching. Yeah, we've got this triad. We've got a teaching, a teacher, and a seeker. And so let's pretend it's all real. And let me tell you how the teaching works. And let's think that it's all separate. And afterwards you'll see that actually these teachings work beautifully to remove that belief in separation. And to remove the belief that the guru, the teacher, the universe are separate. Okay. So the first step of the teaching is called, in Sanskrit, Sravana. Sravana means to listen. Or it literally means hearing. So the first step of the teaching is to hear the teaching. Okay? And I'm going to talk you through 3 or 4 stages, and they sound like discrete steps, and they're presented as discrete steps. We'll see actually that all these steps actually also kind of mishmash, merge together.
A quick question, sorry, while you're on that subject. A lot of the teachings talk about like the mind jumping in and trying to stop. Can you say a bit about that? I mean, it's not from the scriptures.
You won't find that in the scriptures.
No, it's not from the scriptures. It's from sort of like the teachers who very good teachers. But
you won't find that in the scriptures.
Yeah, but these teachers talk about very popular teachers, and they're lovely teachings about the mind attacking and the mind wanting to resist. Would you be able to comment on that, or would you be able to say something about that?
Well, we can get to it. Because the way the traditional teachings work is that it bypasses a lot of those problems. Because when you come up with a firm foundation in the teachings, the way the methodology evolves is that a lot of the problems that come up in a Western satsang teaching, where one teacher's explaining it in one way, Roger's explaining it one way, Tom's explaining it a different way,
Brilliant.
Yeah, but every teaching has limitations. Including mine, including Roger's, including Vedanta, including Buddhism. Everything has its limitations, as wonderful as they might be. There are advantages of the way I speak, and there are disadvantages too. And maybe we could talk about that. That would be quite interesting, I think, if we have time. But the way the traditional teachings develop is they minimize the suffering along the path. Because what can happen is when the sense of me is seen through, for a lot of people, it can be a horrible experience. It can be a very, very scary time. And the traditional teachings put things in to stop that happening. Because they've seen that happen lots of times. Oh yeah, if we do this in this way first, then that doesn't happen. And then you see the mind coming in. Oh right, I can see that people keep on coming on with their mind. Let's put something else in here to stop that happening. But I just want to quickly go over this. I don't want to spend too long on it. The first step is listening to the teachings. You hear the teachings. They go in on a conceptual level, And then at the end of Sravana, at the end of listening, you now have a conceptual understanding of the teachings. Okay? You don't know if they're true, you don't know if they're not true, but you know what the teacher is trying to say. You know what the teaching is trying to say. But you've no idea if it's true or not. You've just got a bunch of concepts in your mind. So already it's saying you're listening, you're using the mind, you're absorbing the context, you're taking notes, you're understanding the concepts of the teaching. That's Sravana for step 1. Step 2 is manana, which means contemplation or reflection or thinking. And in step 2, you now understand the conceptual theoretical teachings. But are they true? So now what you do, you look in your actual experience. And you see, in light of having heard the teachings and understood them, now you say, well, are they true? And you might have some questions that come up on the way. Oh, this bit seems true, that bit doesn't. You talk to the teacher, you have an exchange. And then the teacher clears up all the doubts. The teaching clears up all the doubts. And at the end of step 2, you now have a genuine experiential understanding. What in the scriptures is called a direct understanding. Step 1 leads to conceptual understanding. In the scriptures they call that indirect understanding. And then the step 2, manana, leads to, you actually have a proper, this is a realization now. You've seen the sky. It's like, okay, step 1 was the sky exists. If you look up, if you stop walking, you look up, you see the sky. Okay, I've got that now. If you stop walking, you look up, I see the sky. I've got it. Okay, got it. Got the teaching. That's the Shravana. Now, I'm actually going to stop walking now. This is scary. I've been walking forward all my life. I've been looking at the ground all my life, and now I'm going to stop. And you find it quite difficult because you're so used to walking forward, you're so used to thinking in your own set ways. Suddenly you could stop, and you look up and you see the sky. It's like, oh my gosh, it's actually there. Now you have your own genuine understanding. This is at the end of step 2. This is such a liberation because you have insight.
It actually, even because we don't know what looking up is. So we've heard we don't know what stop is.
Yeah.
At first is I have to stop and look up, but we don't know what that really is. And as the first stage goes in more and more, we understand what that is theoretically more and more. And then the second stage continues to develop that until and it actually happens. Is this, am I adding? Yeah. And it actually happens. We've never known how to look up. And it's like the baby that eventually just says mummy for the first time. It would be as surprised as the mother. And I was like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. Yeah. So this is a progression. It sounds simple. Oh, I just have to look up, but we don't know how to do that. And the process brings us to this spontaneous shift where, and here it's always been there. I just never looked up, but I didn't have any idea what looking up was. And that's the realization. So,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The thing about the realization is that often happens quickly. You need a relatively quiet mind. It doesn't need to be super quiet, but you need to be able to stop and look at your experience and see what's true in your experience. And your experience is the authority, but it's been aided by the teaching, which has guided you, which has pointed you in the right direction. You see, so these two work together, and there's so much freedom there. You realize, oh yeah, I see what all the teachings are talking about now. I understand. When I read some poetry of Rumi there, I got it. And this is where a lot of you may well be, because you will have a realization, you will have some kind of insight that's come in. You would have had a lot of suffering, I hope, maybe, fall away through these insights. You realize, on some level, there's no one here. It's really profound. That's step 2. Right? We've got 1 or 2 more steps to go on the traditional teachings. When you look up, that whole insight just comes to you quite effortlessly. And it can come, as I said, without you even realizing it. And you maybe realize it in retrospect, oh gosh, I've just seen the sky. How did I do that? Oh, I stopped and looked up. Oh yeah, that's what the teaching said. So it can happen in some really interesting ways. When that happens, also there can be a huge release. Because before you were constricted, you were suffering, you were identified with the me. And now there's an opening into something vast and spacious. So there's a contrast experience, you see. Contrast from contraction to expansion. And that can feel amazing. So there are a few traps that can occur there. You can start thinking the feeling of expansion is the sky. Whereas actually it's just a transition from contraction to expansion. And you might try and chase that feeling, rather than realize the sky is ever present. See, when you realize what the teachers have pointed to, you realize that there's no one here. There was never anyone here. Everything, it was always like this, and this is all there is, kind of thing. And it's so simple. So then, why do we need another couple of steps? Why are they there in the traditional teachings? Because these traditional teachers have seen the mistakes that occur along the way. They've seen lots of people go down the wrong paths, and they've tried to correct that out of a compassion for their fellow beings. And what happens then is that the tendency, so we use this analogy of walking along, looking at the ground as being suffering, and then stopping and looking at the sky as being insight, illumination, direct experiential understanding. What happens is that we're so used to having walked forward, and we're so, to put it back in, to throw the metaphor away for a bit, we're so used to identifying as a me, and thinking of ourselves as a separate entity, and relating to an external world in that way, in which we are a small, vulnerable, limited thing, and therefore we have to protect ourselves, we have to worry about illness, we've got to worry about death and all these things, because we are this limited body-mind entity. We've been doing that habitually for so long that we fall back into that. It's not even we fall back into it, it's overpowering, you know. It's just like a bad habit that you've had for such a long time. You didn't even realize it was a habit. You just thought it was the way things were, that there is separation. It's so deeply ingrained, it just keeps on coming back. So, and as it keeps on coming back, the suffering keeps on coming back. So even though you've had this wonderful experience, and you've seen there's no one here, or you've seen that everything is consciousness, or whatever that, however you phrase your insight, your awakening experience, there's still this habitual tendency to identify as a me that's there, and it keeps on coming up, and it keeps on fucking your life up, it keeps on fucking everything up. You keep on suffering, you keep on doing things you don't think you should do, you keep on having that cigarette, you keep on eating too many pies, whatever it is, whatever bad habits, they keep on coming because the habitual tendency to identify as a me is still there. And in Sanskrit, the Sanskrit word for habitual tendency is vasana. Have people heard that word before, vasana? So these are your vasanas to identify. Egoic vasanas are the tendencies to identify as a me and suffer. So now, even though you've seen this beautiful sky, you're still you keep on walking forward and looking at the ground, you keep on suffering and doing silly things, and you're not always as kind as you mean to be, you lose your temper a lot, and if you stop there, then your teaching ends up being something along the lines of, you know, when you see the sky, nothing changes. Life still, if life was shit before, it's shit afterwards, you know. Which is not the point of the teachings. The point of the teachings is the ending of suffering. It's not, you can see the sky and still suffer, you see. So then you need the step afterwards. As I said, it comes across as 3 separate steps, but it's not really. The last step is a step called nididhyasana, which is often translated as meditation, or it's translated as embodiment, or bringing the teachings into your daily life. This is how we can apply the teachings in our life to remove suffering. We can bring that insight that we've had of vastness, of spaciousness, of freedom, of liberation, of peace, of bliss, of oneness, whatever words you want to use. You can't contain it in the words, right? These are just descriptors that aren't the actuality. These are all pointers. We bring that, there's a whole method of bringing that into our daily life. And if anyone's tried to cure themselves of a bad habit, for most of us, not all of us, and not always, but for most of us, that's a process. It takes time. It takes energy and effort. So this is very different to just stop and look at the sky, which is just like effortless. You just stop and, it's all there. Just in a flash. It's all there. And this is when the teachings say, look, it doesn't take any time. You don't need to practice. You don't need to practice. It's here. It's all here. And when you see the sky up there, you realize the sky is everywhere. The sky is everything. You see, that's the insight part. And then the nididhyasana, the meditation aspect is, but we're still habitually identifying as a me. And there's a process to remove that habitual identification. Now we've seen the truth. Now we've seen the light. There's a process to bring that into the body, as it were. Bring that into the body-mind, into that dualistic interaction that we have, so we don't suffer in the actual appearance of the life, in the dream, you could say. It improves the dream. Because if it's not improving the dream, then it's not very satisfying, and then you're still seeking. And that's what happened, and that's what I see all around me. That's what people come to my meetings and say, and that's what we work through.
Can I ask something about that? Obviously, I'm at that stage. Is that this exactly the same as Roger was saying this morning? It's you either, there were three things, weren't there, which could be look at the dynamics, pleasure, pain, attachments.
So investigation
Investigation.
for yourself based on your own experience following the concepts.
Yeah.
That's a valid movement, and it happens sometimes, and it's one of the valid movements. And then another valid movement is the dropping into being where the suffering gets cut off.
Yeah. Looking at the sky, whatever.
Yeah.
Tom said.
Just knowing that vastness, the essence of the human being, let's say, or whatever it means to you, just be that. Or a subset of that is witnessing the suffering without trying to do anything. So there's two forms. It either cuts off the suffering, or the suffering remains and you witness it. And the third movement I spoke about was feeling, really coming to feel the vasanas not at a distance, just allowing them to turn into raw emotion and be. So none of these things are things you do, they're just different movements that can happen when we allow ourselves. So those are so I don't take it from there.
I wanted to just remember what your
Yeah,
version of what Tom's going to say. It's
Yeah.
the same place. You're talking about exactly that same place.
It's a slightly different framework, but it's the same essential thing. And when Roger and I talk about this, we can see how it's the same thing. It just maybe presented in a slightly different way. One thing Roger mentioned, which I really like about the way Roger presents it, is it's not something you do. I often present it as something you do. But one way of thinking about it is that when you've had insight, when you realise there's no one here, then you can realise no one's doing anything any other way all the time. No one ever was. This is all just happening. This is happening, that's happening. There's no duality here, even though someone might interpret this as duality. There's never any duality. That's the illusion. But the way the teaching can work is that prior to insight, prior to manana, the end of manana, these things are things you do because you think of yourself as an individual, so you can do them. Once you've had the insight that there's no one here, then you realise, this is not something that we do. This is something that just happens. And the teachings then are just a part of what arises, and they go in, they update the conditioning of the apparent individual, and they have an apparent effect within the dream.
So, but you still haven't presented your last...
No, I haven't, no.
Thank you, okay.
Keep on getting interrupted. Yeah, so so the thing to notice is that, see, in reality, when you hear the teachings, many of us will start thinking about them and reflecting on them and comparing them to our direct experience straight away. And many of us will have an insight or a partial insight straight away. So that's you've already done Shravana and Manana. You've already listened and reflected and realised. And then sometimes the habitual tendencies that are associated with something, maybe it will just fall away. So maybe because you've listened to Roger speak and talk about anger in a certain way, suddenly you don't feel, your anger just goes. So then your nididhyasana, your embodiment of that anger teaching is you've already passed through those three stages with respect to that teaching already, you see. So it doesn't have...
With respect to that particular issue, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because you said with respect to that teaching. But
sorry, yes.
Just to make it clear.
Thank you.
With respect to that, one of many different things that need to be worked out, once it's gone, effectively you could say all three stages have happened, even though some other issues might still be on stage one.
Yeah, you might have heard the teaching about anger, that's Shravana. You might have seen the truth of that in your genuine experience, so it's not just a conceptual thing. And then that has led to your anger going. So now with respect to anger, you've gone through Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. It's embodied in your life, and you're not suffering because of anger. But maybe you haven't got an insight into your addiction to chocolate. Okay. So maybe you've got to see how the teachings can... Because, if you can't relate your non-duality teachings to your addiction to chocolate. I mean, that's the kind of bridge that needs to be made if you're a chocolate addict.
Just what's your thought? Because what you've said, we've heard it's not about becoming a better human being, and so in the framework I put forward, anger is a biological reaction, and it isn't suffering. It isn't what the process will bring an end to. So anger, biological reaction. My preference for chocolate, biological reaction. Suffering is my attitude of feeling shameful for eating chocolate, my attitude of feeling guilty for getting angry. And my blame would be my attitude towards the other getting angry, for example. So we specify that the suffering that falls away is all internal attitudinal, and a lot of what happens through the body, which isn't always preferable, we have shortcomings, isn't necessarily going to change. The process isn't about making me into a saint. It's making me into a very tolerant person, tolerant on an attitudinal level, not a biological. We might still be very intolerant on a biological level, where it might be irritable, but I'm at peace with my irritability. So I think just because we're using...
Yeah, can I just say, that has got really clear for me, that I can have a bit of something, say with my dad, and there's no problem with it at all. But yeah, so that bit is definitely clear.
If we're trying to be Zen on the outside, that's we're sort of trying to fake or imitate what we think peace is. And I'd say actually where Zen, peace, or the end of suffering is Zen on the inside, and the outside is its movement. It doesn't have to be so Zen-like. So I thought, because you're using an analogy, sometimes the analogy itself might be much more using biologicals. So I wanted to throw that in. I think
I agree with that.
We're happy that we're talking about the same suffering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for that. So yeah, the stage 4 is Samadhi. Samadhi is a word that tends to mean extreme silence of the mind. It's when the thoughts have really, 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 really calmed down. Specifically, the identification with them as being a me. It's when the identification of me is basically dead. But then there's still the biological body that appears to be a me. But it isn't, it's just an empty thing, you could say. So what happens as we understand the teachings, as they integrate it into us, as we realize the wholeness and peace that's already here, that's fully here, we don't, because I've got this chocolate thing in my head now. Say you're really, really leaning on chocolate because you're addicted to chocolate, because it makes you feel good. As the teachings come in, as the insight deepens and comes into your life and actualizes, you feel a sense of peace. You still might like chocolate. You still might prefer, I don't know, milk chocolate to dark chocolate or whatever. But now, you don't need that to fulfill you anymore. And as you don't need the chocolate to fulfill you, the addiction to it fades away. And this happens with all the me-centered thoughts. They start to come down, they start to dampen down, and the mind becomes more peaceful and calm. And this is where the bliss of the self starts to come in. You start to feel ananda, which is the Sanskrit word for bliss or happiness. You start to feel shanti, which is the Sanskrit word for peace. It starts, the peace and the bliss and the happiness and the end of suffering becomes a reality for you. And the mind, thinking still happens. It doesn't. There's no sense of there's a me thinking. It's just thoughts spontaneously occurring, like the heart spontaneously beating. And what happens then is the mind becomes very still, very calm. And that's samadhi. And samadhi can also be a practice that you can actually try. And when you hear the teachings, it might cause a reaction in your mind to encourage you to try it. And in Samadhi, it's very, very powerful. It often happens very naturally anyway. So these teachings, you don't need to know about them for them to occur. They often just occur naturally anyway. They're a part of this experience, this waking dream, you could call it, has a certain order to it. And this just appears to be a part of that order. So as we become more peaceful, we pass through these phases. And our mind just becomes very, very calm and very, very still. And this is where the stillness and the silence teachings come in. They're very, very deep teaching right at the end, and it's the Samadhi teachings. And you end up with an extreme stillness, and often there are no thoughts there at all, or very few thoughts. And personally, I often say no thoughts. And what I like about Roger is that he'll clarify why that's not true. But I'll often say there's no thoughts, because for me, there are no thoughts. Thoughts, when I use the word thought, I'm thinking about something that I have created, I'm thinking. And for me, in my experience, there's no thinking, but thoughts are happening. And many of you will understand what I mean when I say that, because you've probably been listening to these kinds of teachings. So for me, it doesn't feel like there's any thought. Like if a bird flies past the window and you see a bird fly past, you don't feel like you're doing anything. So when a thought comes along, I don't feel like I'm thinking. So I often say there's no thought.
So this is curious for me, because these sort of statements can sometimes lead to a lot of confusion. Yeah. And Ramesh was one to say, hang on, let's be clear about it. If a bird flies past and it's effortless to see it, i.e. you didn't see it, so you can't say there's no bird.
No.
There's a bird.
Correct.
And this goes
but
back to...
you wouldn't say you're birding. But you're right, yeah.
Yeah. So then when we see that the mechanism of thought being there is thinking, but not a personal activity that a separate independent doer is doing, then we could say, thinking, there is thinking and there is thought. Thinking is happening. But then this is where we started. There's lots of different teachings and they address different problems, and so they'll say things different ways. And so it's valid. So what Tom's saying is, he's saying there is no thought, because it fits into his teaching that is not random. It understands what the problem is and it addresses the problem for a certain perspective. And then if someone comes to me and says, I'm waiting for there to be no thought, in my experience, I say, well, from time to time, if you're watching a sunset and you drop into your state of being, there's nothing for you to do. As in nothing practical for you to do. There's no need to think about anything. There will be a period of no thinking. There will be a period of no thought. And it's beautiful. But don't expect no thought to be your experience on an ongoing basis, because the working mind is needed in daily life, and thought will always be there as part of the mechanism of living in daily life. And the person might think, well, I thought there was no thought because so-and-so told me there was no thought in his experience. So then his experience is with sans thought, no thought. And so there's a clarification. And that clarification can be problematic earlier on, because it might be too technical a detail that gets in the way of solving a problem that needs to be solved. So a teaching says, no, I'm not going to talk about the different types of thoughts. I'm going to talk about no thought. If we hear there's no thought, one of the things where the body is going to become practiced at is thinking less. It's going to be interested in no thought, and so it's going to have a motivation. It's going to learn how to function with less thought, for example. So misinformation from one perspective, which is no thought, is not wrong. It's doing a job.
It's doing a job. That's the key. It's not true. is doing a job. And that's the way a lot of these teachings work. They're not true, but they have a truth within them.
What's the particular?
Have you got the microphone?
Just a very quick question.
She got in there.
What about what about the value of values, like how to serve the Dharma field in this context?
What was the question? I missed that. Sorry.
The value of values. I
Yes.
just thinking if also serve the Dharma field in some way.
The Dharma, yeah, absolutely. It's really important from the way I teach. So I think the question is asking about the value of values. And that's a term that's used in some Vedanta teachings. So they talk about what is the value of things like being a good person and giving to charity. Is there any value of that in that? And the way I express it, the way the traditional teachings in Buddhism and Vedanta express it, is that yes, there is a huge value. Just being good is great on so many levels because one, it makes you feel good as a person. It can spread harmony in your family, in your environment, in your society. But it also can lead to peace of mind, and that can enhance your ability to listen to the teachings, and that can enhance your ability for insight. And as the insight pours in, you realise there's no one here. This is empty. This sense of who I thought I was is actually emptiness. Then goodness naturally comes from that, because what we call bad things comes from the egoic vasanas, the tendencies to identify as a me, and all the habitual tendencies that come from that. And because we're trying to protect this self-identity, and as we let go of that sense of self-protection, if someone calls you a rude name, you're less likely to sort of react violently and in anger and in violence. Maybe if you're a violent person and someone calls you a rude name, you might feel like hitting them. You might actually hit them. Whereas as the insight comes in, you realise it's just spaciousness, abundance, wholeness. Then you're not acting in that way. So then it starts off as something you might practice because you've heard it in a teaching and you've got faith in the teaching and you've been brought up in a certain culture. And so you practice being good just because that's what you've been taught. And then as the insight comes in, then it's not something you do to try and conform. It's something that comes from within, the Dharma. And Dharma is a complex word, means many different things. In this sense, we're talking about Dharma as ethics, essentially. As the ethical Dharma. The Dharma manifests from within, it's in our hearts. It's a part of the natural order that as we become less ego-centered, we become nicer. But, there's a caveat, is that what we think of as being the Dharma might not be what the Dharma actually is. And I'll give you an example of that. Some people, when they go through this teaching, they're very sort of community-minded people. They are doing lots of good works in the community. What can happen, and it can be quite difficult, is that as these teachings come in, you feel like you don't want to do any community work for some people. These kinds of things these things that you were doing that you thought of as being good, and you thought of yourself as being a good person and contributing to good in the world and in society, what can happen is that suddenly you don't feel like doing that stuff anymore. You think, oh my gosh, am I just becoming some sort of cold-hearted person? And I went through something quite similar to this. When someone I know became quite upset about something, before I'd have been quite upset with them. I'd have really emotionally felt it. And then I suddenly realised, I'm not really bothered by this. And I thought, gosh, I'm quite a bad person. Because all my life I've thought, I'm Tom, I'm a nice guy, I'm a really nice person, I'm a really caring person. And that's who Tom is, that's a part of who Tom is, aren't I great? And there was a little bit of arrogance there with this, aren't I? I'm actually quite a nice guy, and there was a bit of arrogance there with that. Thinking I'm actually better than some of these other people who aren't that nice. I'm pretty cool. And then suddenly I noticed that, oh gosh, I don't actually care that much on some level. And it wasn't that I don't care, it was that before I was really invested in trying to help this person, in trying to heal that person, and I was getting my sense of self from helping them. And now I wasn't getting my sense of self from helping someone else. So those kinds of ego patterns that were actually egoic and self-centered, which I thought were being good, started falling away. But because my ego concepts were still there, I judged myself as, oh gosh, I'm becoming a bad person. But when I had faith in that process, I realised there was a lot of compassion in that. And I was able to actually, sometimes, not always, but sometimes I was able to interact in that kind of situation in a way that was more helpful sometimes and more insightful, because I wasn't so caught up in it. And I wasn't actually invested. And that can be very powerful.
Can I add something to this comment? Because a path of bhakti, for example, where there is going to be much more service to others and dharma, focus on dharma, it's a specific path, and it's approaching the problem a particular way. So the path of jnana yoga is a different path, and it's for different people at different stages with different temperaments and personalities. And some people are not ready to receive information that says, actually, you don't have to be any particular way. You are as God created you, and however you function in any moment is how God wants you to function in this moment. You have been created to function this way. Relax. You don't have to control the way you are. That's some teachings, in fact that's what I'm putting forward, say that, and they're relying on someone being at a particular point where their body makeup is not filled with heavy vasanas that are going to make them completely irresponsible and chaotic in life.
So, for example, if you've got somebody who's got heavy vasanas, say they're incredibly violent, and they realise they're incredibly violent, and they realise that they're destroying their own interpersonal life, and they're creating suffering for other people, and they start to hate them, and they trying to rein in that violence, because that can be quite useful, isn't it? It can be very, very useful if you're a physically violent person to rein in your physical violence. The last thing you want to believe is a teaching that, this is the way God made you, and be free to be yourself. That's not what that person needs to hear, is it? And that person won't be attracted, generally speaking, to that kind of teaching.
That's right. Exactly. There can be a freedom in, you can be not great and be doing things that do hurt others, and it could be a combination. At some point, someone says, don't feel too bad about it. It happened, and you couldn't have done it. And there might be a sense of relief, or someone understands me. I don't really want to be violent. It just happens. And so someone says, I understand, it just happens. I'm not telling you it's good. I'm not telling you that it's a nice way of being, but I understand it, and an acceptance of it is a relief inside, a relief that will probably lead to a change in that violence. So there's that benefit. But going back to this, the Dharma, where people are told to be good, Tom was saying that the not being good is usually a result of certain vasanas inside. And when those vasanas get released, in terms of the teaching I put forward, vasanas really mean the habits based on the belief in doership, personal doership, and attachment to outcomes, where we are craving outcomes and will do whatever we need to get them, including hurting the others, not considering the others, etc. When those vasanas get released, we find that morality isn't something that we have to work hard on. It just becomes a natural movement. So it's like virtues are not something that we should be proud of. They're very natural movements. And so an instruction turns into just a description. We start off hearing instructions of thou shalt not steal. And then we realize, no, that's my true nature when the vasanas fall away. It's not an instruction. I don't have to work hard. So if there's a link between the deeply ingrained energies of doership and attachment to outcomes, the core of the vasana, and the behavior, they're not two. The behavior is an expression of the vasana. It makes sense that you can either change what's at the core and the behavior will change, or you change the output, the expression, you start affecting it on this side, and because it's not two, because it's one dynamic, it's a closed system. You press a balloon, a long balloon, you squeeze one end and this end gets bigger. You squeeze this end and this end gets bigger. So if you're affecting the behavior, and I'm not talking about I'm talking more about the attitudinal behavior, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the greed. So the teachings say, do things for others, not for yourself. Become selfless. So greed and attachment is what it's changing the attitude, which by default has to change what's at its root. It's a way of affecting what's at the root. Jnana Yoga says, look at the root, affect the root by bringing awareness onto it, and then the output will change. And so there are two different ways of dealing with the same thing. And if we think that it's about being good, and don't see that Dharma or serving community is actually affecting the root, then we get attached to being good, and we become proud of when we're good, and we feel shame when we're not good. And so what Tom is saying, that the process at some point can change, where in a way it gets deeper. It says you don't need to be a certain way. It says we've gone past that phase. Just allow yourself to function freely. And then when we start doing that, if we're holding on to the teachings of Dharma, we're still holding on to the teachings. We haven't let go of it. We haven't seen that it's taken us to the shore, and now we have to leave the boat behind. We don't want to carry it on our back. But if we carry the boat on our back for the next phase, and the next phase says, well, now you're not crossing ocean anymore, now you're crossing snow, put the boat down, you don't need it. And put the skis on, and the skis are a different teaching. If we don't realize this, we say, hang on, but the old teaching told me that I have to be good, and now the feeling I have inside and the teaching is saying, don't worry about forcing yourself to be anything in particular. So, there's a time and a place for all the teachings.
There can be a lot of guilt, can't there, when people transition from one aspect of the teaching to another. Yeah. I mean, I notice it with people who have a theistic belief in a God or something, and they're very devoted to a God. And it can come to a point where that devotion to an image or an idea or a felt sense of the divine can become silence. Mm-hmm. It can become very, very silent and still. And then people feel, oh gosh, I've lost touch with the God I'm devoting myself to. But you're actually going beyond that now. We're going to that stillness and silence in which there's a different form of the divine, you could say.
Maybe it ends up being more God than...
Yeah. They're giving up the idea of God, and they're entering into a silence, but it feels like they've lost touch with their God.
Yeah.
And similarly, when you're practicing good works, and then it comes to a point where you don't care about trying to be a good person. You couldn't care less about being a good person. Frida doesn't care about being good. And then goodness arises from that. But in that transition, you might think, oh gosh, I'm terrible now because I'm not in my old paradigm where I was trying to be good.
Mm-hmm. And it becomes...
Yeah. And a lot of guilt can come up about that. It's like, oh gosh, what's happening to me?
When we don't realize exactly what you said, that this is the natural process of a more natural, effortless contribution to society happening in a different way. Before we ask the next question, because you were talking about the 4 stages before, Tom, and thought, and then I jumped in and said, hey, no thought. So you still didn't necessarily get to finish the description of the 4th stage?
Okay, with Samadhi, when you enter into Samadhi is also a meditative state where there's no thinking, there's no thoughts. That is incredible. See, some of our vasanas, some of our habitual tendencies to identify as a me are so deeply rooted. It's still thought-based, but they're often put into us at a pre-verbal stage in our development. So before we learnt to speak and articulate ourselves properly, we developed habits and ideas and concepts as very young children, perhaps. I'm trying to think of an example. Or even not pre-verbal. Say you've been through a trauma, and say you had a particularly traumatic experience, and it happened outside, and there was a house to your left, and there was a blue door on the house while you had this traumatic experience. And now every time you go past the blue door, it just kind of makes you jump a bit, because there's an association between this trauma and the blue door. And you've thought about it, because you're a rational person, you're a thinking person. You think, well, it's just a blue door, it's an inanimate object, it's painted blue, there's no way it's going to harm me, it can't hurt me. Ah! And every time you see a blue door, there's this sort of reaction that occurs at the gut level. And those kinds of habitual tendencies are so deeply set into us, because it's our body trying to protect ourselves from a trauma. Our brain creates these links when we have traumatic experiences to try and protect us. And so when we see something that reminds us of that trauma, our body's saying, look, don't go there. Because the way the body's wired isn't always rational like our minds can be. Our minds aren't always rational, of course, either. So the thing about going into a samadhi state is that at that very deep level of habitual egoic tendencies, or habitual tendencies that create suffering on an illogical basis, they can be purified. So we go into samadhi where there's no thoughts, and we're sitting there, pure consciousness they call it, where there's just a sense of awareness or being without any thought there. And it comes to you naturally as the teachers progress. And then these deeply held vasanas get purified. So it's sometimes called in Vedanta the great purifier, this samadhi state. And then at some point, when that gets cut off, then the suffering is just ended. And that's how the teachings present the samadhi teachings and the 4 stages of the path. And the same thing in Buddhism as well. You get those same 4 stages. The first 2 are still called Shravana and Manana. And I think the 3rd stage in Vedanta is Nididhyasana. I think in Buddhism it's Bhavana, I think. And I think the 4th stage is still Samadhi. They use very, very similar language. I can't quite remember the Buddhist terminology.
So just recap the 4, not using the Sanskrit names,
okay.
And how they all fit together, and how they're not one stage, the 2nd stage, and the 3rd stage, and the 4th stage, but they all happen simultaneously, but maybe more of stage 1 first, then stage 2 starts happening. A bit of stage 3, a bit of stage 4 comes in on one issue, and on another issue it's just stage 1 happening. So it's a very complex interaction. At first, at the very beginning, stage 4 won't be happening anywhere, and stage 3 won't be happening anywhere. But maybe after a short period of time, stage 1, 2, and 3 are happening in some areas.
And it's just a guide. It's just like a nice overview that if you find it helpful, then it's helpful.
It's a description. They're just descriptions of what will happen through this process that I said, the process itself is guided by an intelligence, like the biological growing is guided by an intelligence that we don't need to worry about. The brain develops and we learn how to walk and talk. Your parents don't really teach you how to walk and talk. If it was up to our parents to teach us how to walk or talk, we'd be in trouble. It uses the input they put in, but so much more input and so much natural fusing of things that it's a process that's very intelligent, this biological stuff, and the spiritual seeking journey is guided by the same different, it's not biological, but the same sort of intelligence that is moving the process. And so we see a commonality in people going through spirituality, in commonality in the different paths, in particular, because they bring in different methodologies. And so we can trust that we don't have to make it happen. And so these are just descriptions from people who have seen for themselves the process. So it's a description that says this will happen. And then once we start seeing the process based on how the description describes it, it can help make it more palatable, more recognizable. And the recognizing of the process can become part of the process itself. a deepening of the process. So that's why all these descriptions are there. They're not instructions, but more descriptions of what might happen. And we see that, and that becomes part of the feedback loop.
Yeah, with a big importance, one thing that really helps the seeker with is that it can tell you when you get stuck on a bit, because it's the stage after manana which the scriptures really emphasize, do not get stuck there. So quickly run through it. You've got listening to teachings, you hear the teachings, you understand them conceptually in the mind. You don't know if they're true or not.
Can I, at these stages, interrupt and put it into the context of the teaching I put forward?
Please.
So it says, the teachings are concepts, they're not the truth, they're pointers. Please, you don't even need to listen to the pointers. The pointers are delivered and they'll take hold or they won't take hold. And they will become understood intellectually. Once they're understood intellectually, you say, I understand what you're saying. It's clear to me intellectually. I don't have the experience of it. I was told, as we've spoken, you smile at a monkey and it's going to be taken as a sign of aggression. I understood the concept intellectually. I didn't have an experience of it.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's true because I haven't seen it for myself. Just, so-and-so is telling me about what happens if I interact with a monkey, but who knows if that's actually true. But I understand what so-and-so is saying. And then stage 2 is you actually examine your own experience in the light of the teachings you've heard. And you discover the truth of them. Or you discover holes in the teaching. And so then there might be a back and forth between the teacher and yourself. And you say, well, actually, when I look, it's not quite like that. And then you'll understand how it all fits together. So there's a back and forth process there.
You'll often find that it's not the teaching that is out of whack, but how we're looking. Our looking capacity is limited by certain things in the system. So I had all sorts of things said to Ramesh, well, I'm not so sure about this. When I see it, it's a bit different. And he would stick to his guns. And the fact always turned out that when something changed in me and I get to see it even deeper than I was before, I go, the concept is so perfect. It was just I wasn't seeing it closely enough. So this second point is, please take the concept. You don't really need to put a lot of effort in it. Just as you're going through your daily life, the concepts will pop up and you'll say, oh, that's what that concept says. I see it. Right? Like when I smiled at a monkey, having forgotten about the concept, I smiled because I was impressed at this little monkey, and it jumped back a meter and screeched. And I then go, oh, I remembered the concept. I go, oh, there it is, tick. You put a tick next to the concept. So you've seen it for yourself based on your own daily life experience. And the more times it gets seen for yourself, the deeper the intellectual understanding goes. It goes from an intellectual understanding to something that you can convincingly explain and talk about from your own experience, no longer just a philosophical or intellectual concept.
Yeah. That's great, yeah. And the other thing is that often you'll say, no, that teaching is completely wrong, I don't agree with that teaching, that's not true, And then when you get it, you realise, oh gosh, I was wrong. And that happens so often in these spiritual teachings. And it's the great value of the traditional scriptures, is that they have been validated by hundreds of people over a few thousand years or a few centuries. That they're there for a reason. They're like being handed down to us as, look, this is my gift to you. This is my gift to you. We've all figured it out. It's not these teachings aren't the work of necessarily one person. Especially in the case of the Vedanta teachings, but with the Buddhist teachings too. I mean, this has been handed down to you. This is for you. You can argue with it. That's fine. That's healthy. But also see if you can see the truth there. Because I guarantee, often what happens is that people go, no, that's definitely not true. I don't believe that. That's not right at all. And then you see them a year and a half later and go, actually, that was true. And that's all a part of this manana. This is all part of this stage 2, which is thinking and developing a genuine insight for yourself.
One of the things that happens there is that you sometimes think you know. I think I've seen this thing because you intellectually understood. And one of the skills of the teacher is to actually reveal to you, no, you actually haven't seen this thing yet. And
that's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
It's great fun though. The teacher did that to me, and it was amazing. I was convinced I understood the teaching, and he finally says, "You really don't understand the teaching," and boom, that brought about the clarity. Yeah, fantastic.
A lot of time you'll find a teacher is very empathetic, even though they might sometimes be very sharp, because that's the blow that needs to be delivered. It's not personal. They understand. They were on the other side, and they were the one arguing. They were the one that was a little arrogant and said, "No, this isn't right. I don't believe it." And what happens when it's revealed to us is there's a humility that says, "Oh wow, I thought I knew. I think I know so much, and in fact I know nothing." The teacher's gone through that, and so there's a lot of patience. There's a lot of empathy. I know that I could have been put in my place a lot of times when I was with Ramesh, and he was always very kind. If you were with Nisargadatta, he would have thrown you out a few times, but that was kindness as well. He was doing it out of an understanding of what was needed for some people. One of the key points here is that even if a teacher gets a bit aggressive, really deep down, they'll empathize with where you are, and you'll be welcome back, especially if the humility has kicked in.
Yeah, you've got to be careful there, don't you? Because, I'm very wary that there are abusive teachers out there as well. And I know you. You're a really nice person. You're a lovely chap. And so when you say that, I think most of us in the room, if we're resonating with what you say, we trust you. I trust you. And so if there is a harsh word, it's within that trust. But there are a lot of people who abuse that, aren't there? A lot of teachers who kind of, really verbally, emotionally, maybe more, but verbally, emotionally abuse their students or followers or seekers on some level, and then say, "Look, put up with it because I'm amazing, and you should listen to me."
This is a very good point. It actually, I don't often bring this in, but I think that seekers need to ask an important question of the teachers they listen to, because the fact is there are a lot of people that have a lot of insight, and they feel drawn to share that. And there's very good reason with that, because the insight itself and some of the unfortunate circumstances that can happen when a teacher isn't really gone through the whole process themselves, they can all be beneficial. Both the insight that the teacher has and the unfortunate circumstances can all lead to good things in the end, let's say. But if you're going to follow someone and trust them, I think we shouldn't be afraid of asking the teacher if they have continuous, unbroken peace of mind in their experience. A simple, straightforward question. And a yes and a no answer is fine for me. A complicated answer may be valid to the question, but a simple yes and no answer is simpler. I think a lot of teachers don't talk about, there's two reasons why you wouldn't emphasize the end of suffering. One, because you don't have it, and if you don't have it, it's hypocritical. You can't sit there genuinely and say you have something. So they'll talk about insights and awakenings, which they've had. And the other reason you wouldn't talk about it is because the particular teaching understands that those listening to it may turn it into a desire, an objective, an expectation that will cause its own suffering. And so it's safer not to introduce the carrot, and that's another reason why it won't be spoken about. If you ask the question to the teacher, have you got the end of suffering? in your experience? Because actually that's all I'm really looking for. I'm looking for happiness in this life for me as a person. You know, the teacher, after liberation, still carries on having to live their life as an individual. So there's no harm in saying, what Ramesh asked his gurus, because Ramesh was very practical, he was a banker. And he said, as a banker, you can't be impractical. It doesn't work. The bank will go bankrupt. You have to be practical. So at some point when he was seeking, he said, I want to ask a question, an important question of my guru. Now this wasn't Nisargadatta, this was an earlier guru. And the question was, what will I have after enlightenment that I don't have before? And his guru at the time got infuriated by the question. So this look of rage started to come up over the guru. And then the guru saw that other people in the room were interested in the question. So instead of getting angry, he contained himself and he said, when you're enlightened, you'll know. Ramesh said, that's an answer you give when you're not really giving an answer. His question is, what will I have after enlightenment that I don't have before? So that was part of Ramesh's conditioning that made him say, I have to do this myself. I can't rely on these people without me being part of the process. So the question he then gave to seekers, he said, ask this question and I'll give you a straightforward answer. What will I have after enlightenment that I didn't have before? He says, very simple. You won't have special powers. You won't be able to be in two places at once. You won't be able to turn sand into gold or magically get a car parking spot whenever you want it. What you will have after enlightenment that you didn't have before, essentially it's another way of saying, what am I really looking for? What is really available? His answer is simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. Buddha, when you boil it down, makes it clear. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. The cause of desire is attachment. He didn't say enlightenment is blah, 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 blah. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. So if you ask a teacher, have you got an experience of life where suffering has come to an end? And if they say yes, I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, it's the value of discernment, isn't it? And really being careful where you place your trust. And there's a danger of being too trusting, and there's a danger of being too cynical.
Mm-hmm. So this is a pragmatic way of discerning how trusting you can be, and still, are they telling you the truth? You don't really know. You have to figure it out based on the resonance and all these things. So there are a lot of teachers that with the, let's say, understanding that I'm not doing anything, are still functioning in a way that can hurt people. The understanding is accurate, that that was a happening, and from an internal point of view, no point feeling shame. Shame is not helpful. But that doesn't mean don't acknowledge that what has happened is not positive relative to certain benchmarks. Don't pass it as being, this is perfect, my behavior is perfect, and it's your lack of enlightenment that has an issue with it. That's also accurate, but we still have to take responsibility for actions that clearly relative to certain benchmarks, for example, benchmarks of morality, benchmarks of kindness. We have to take responsibility just on the discernment level of being able to say, yes, these are my shortcomings. Biologically, I have this shortcoming, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it by saying it's just a happening. My understanding is it's just a happening, and that is the insight. So not to be involved in the happening, but I want to be able to make it clear to people that it is a shortcoming. And if we see that these shortcomings are there because of deeply ingrained vasanas that are still in place, meaning the understanding that sees it as just a happening hasn't penetrated all the way through the system where it's uprooted the vasanas, then we have to be even more discerning. We have to say that's not just a biological reaction, but that's an outcome of a vasana that's still in place. How often they don't even know that that's the case, which is why it gets dismissed as just a happening. And so there is an abuse that can happen.
Yeah, I was always very wary of that when I was seeking. I was always very wary that I don't want to be taken for a ride. Has this person actually got anything useful to offer? I was always interested in the end of suffering. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really care if it was non-duality or duality. As long as the suffering went, that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Okay, well back to, then you go through contemplating the teachings and you stop and you look and you see. And you need a relatively quiet mind, but it doesn't need to be super quiet. As long as it's not too turbulent, so it doesn't get in the way of just being able to contemplate your direct experience. And then you see, and it can happen just like that, just like a flash. A Zen metaphor for it is, it's like the bottom of a bucket of water just falling out, and then the water just falls out. And it's just like, it's just the seeing. And something's changed. But often what you're left with is a me that's seen something. Now you've seen the sky, but then there's the habitual tendency to recreate the me that's seen. And now you've seen something and you want more of it, or maybe you've seen something, you think you've got it. And this is a wonderful stage on the journey, and it's often mistaken for enlightenment, depending on where you're coming at it from.
This is stage 3 you're talking about?
This is the end of stage 2.
End of stage 2, okay.
So you've seen something, but you're essentially a me that's seen something. And there's still the habitual tendency to identify as a me. There's all these egoic vasanas, egoic habits that are still occurring. So that's called insight. At the end of contemplation, you have an insight. Insight happens quickly, not too much effort, relatively calm mind, doesn't have to be very still. And you don't really necessarily have to have a practice. You don't have to meditate for 40 hours, a week or whatever. You can just be walking down the street and be thinking about things in your daily life. And then you have a seeing, but the vasanas are still there. And then there's the sort of integration or meditation. And here now, this is where often a practice, or it takes time for these habitual tendencies to come up, to be felt, to be allowed to manifest fully and be felt fully, without being getting involved in them either. So this is, I think, what Roger was talking about, these 3 different aspects. There's the witnessing aspect where you're not getting involved, you're seeing things objectively, but you're allowing things completely to come up and be fully felt. There's no suppression. And things can be seen very clearly, so there's a natural investigation into what's happening, and it's just these arisings happening. And as things come through the body, and you see there's no one here, these vasanas, habitual tendencies become purified, meaning we let go of them. For some reason, without realizing, we stop having these cravings for chocolate cake or fast cars, or suddenly you don't feel like you want to do as well in your career as you used to. You don't have so much motivation to earn loads and loads of money, and your self-centered desires basically start to drop away. And you can feel out of odds with society, because most of society is telling us that we need to do things and get places and be productive and attain things, and we need those things to be happy. So it can be a funny time. But then as that contemplation, meditation comes to fruition, we attain a deep silence. Deep silence, which is incredibly purifying. And in the midst of that, the knot in the scriptures. They talk about the knot of the ego. It's an illusory knot. It gets severed. You realise there's nothing here, and at the same time, all the habitual tendency to identify as a me drops away as well, and it's just indescribable freedom, and that's the fruition, and that's the peace, and that's the end of suffering.
Good, you just described it. Thank you.
That's the peace. That's the end of suffering. It's the end of there's no me, there's no you.
So, but
there's no this.
So that description,
and
the
there's
end
no
of
that. But the end of suffering is a nice practical description, and the other stuff you can, because at the same time there's a Tom and there's a Roger and there's a Hall.
But because I think you had said this undescribable freedom. So we've heard this. Oh, nothing changes is one description that we often. It's more or less the same as before. And it's right, it's correct from one point of view, because we find we're still the human being that goes to bed and wakes up in the morning and has a shower.
That it's just the same is at the end of manana. When you look up at the sky and you see the skies there in all its beauty, it's always there. Everything's the same, but now that you've seen the light. That's at the end of stage 2, the manana stage. Nothing's changed. You're still the same person. You're still doing the same things. But you've now everything's happening in freedom. But by the time the path deepens and the purification happens, something has changed. The suffering's gone.
That's it.
So you can't say it's just, some things are just the same.
That's the point, is if we're living in life and it's a sweltering hot day and a sweltering hot week, so much heat, but you're going to work and you're doing everything in your normal day, and then something changes and the weather changes, and yet you're still going to work and doing everything the same. On the one hand, you say, well, nothing's really changed. I was going to work then and I'm going to work now. And on the other hand, the sweltering heat which was there is no longer there. So if we look at on that level, we find it's radically different. And nothing's really changed sometimes is there just to rein in the mind that has these expectations of this shift where everything is going to change, and suddenly there is no more human being. Maybe even we're going to dissolve into, we're walking up the Himalaya mountains and we dissolve, as in the physical body dissolves. There are people that have beliefs that that's what liberation is. Completely impractical ideas of liberation. Essentially, in my experience, belief structures. Because the teaching that they're exposed to is using a particular methodology, and as Tom said, some teachings will always have shortfalls. They'll be very good at doing something, but they have their shortfalls. So the notion that nothing really changes is part of the teaching to try and counter certain expectations that might be in place. And then on the other hand, it's not entirely right to say nothing exactly changes. When someone says, what will I have after enlightenment that I didn't have before? The answer is the end of suffering. Now that's pretty significant. If you ask me, we could say there are two ways of living life. And one is more optimal than the other. From a human experience, if we find ourselves living life with no suffering, one, we find that we tend to be more productive with less effort. And two, we find that the experience itself is free of an uncomfortableness, which means it's optimal compared to before. It's a change. Yeah.
With the you were talking about there about this being absorbed in silence and then the falling away of this separate self. Does that happen in the third stage or the fourth stage, or were you suggesting?
Well, in this kind of scheme of classifying things, it happens at the end of the fourth stage. So you can go into a samadhi. There's still these vasanas there. There's still this sense of being a me going into a samadhi at times. You might intellectually know there's not. You might be intellectually saying to yourself, "There's no me here." but you're still at times acting as if there is a me here. There's no one here, there's no one here, and then someone calls you a name, and you go, how dare you call me that name, I hate being called that name. So you might, on one hand, there's disconnect between what you believe, you're saying there's no me, but then the reality of everyday life comes along, and all the habits and the tendencies that have originally sprouted from a belief in a me are still all in place. It's a bit like the tree of ignorance, in which the trunk is the belief in the me, and then all the habits are the branches and the leaves that come on top. And what can happen is you can see there's no me, it's like serving the trunk, but this tree just stays levitated there, and you still have all these habitual tendencies which are all egoic, and are causing suffering, and causing not suffering just to yourself, but people around you, and you're in chaos and all the different aspects of your life, and things like that. So as the mind quietens down, we're kind of pruning the tree. And that takes time, and then and the tree disappears, and then dissolves, and there's no tree left. The entire structure of the ego and the me, together with all its habitual tendencies, goes. And when that goes, that's when you really understand what the Buddha and the Hindu and the Vedanta teachings are pointing to. That's when you read them, you think, oh yeah, it is just like peace. It is silence, it is bliss, it is light, it is love. You won't understand that aspect of the teaching when you've just seen through the me, but all the rubbish is still going on, and you're just suffering. You might see glimpses of it here and there.
What's your definition of the me? Because you also said that the falling away in when you see what is being pointed at. You used another terminology. That there is no one here, let's say, I think you said there's no one here, and we've stopped identifying as a me. Mm-hmm. You might not, it's actually, you don't have to answer this question, because I know that we do it differently. I have definitions for those things that sort of try to put them into words that are most accurate from my experience. Because just saying there's no person, for example, can become a little confusing to someone. They're then waiting for no person. So no person might mean that the body dissolves. Let's say it's not there anymore. Because they've got a definition of what a person is. Do you want to describe?
I really like the way you're answering the question, because you give me the option. Because I was talking to Roger a couple of days ago about, I love the way Roger defines his terms. I think it's really valuable. And one confession I have to make is, when I first started sharing this, I was much better at defining my terms. And often now I find, and I'm sorry, I can't be bothered half the time. It's funny, the way it expresses itself, the way this teaching expresses itself, through Tom, you could say. Tom doesn't always bother to describe things and explain things. But if he's asked, I will often explain. And he often slips into the third person when he talks about himself sometimes. It's a bit pompous, sorry.
Is it fair to say that as the understanding gets deeper and deeper, the conceptual distinctions become irrelevant?
Yeah.
And it's just about, who cares about it, and all of the separating sort of comes back, all of the mental separation, which allows the descriptions to happen more easily, falls away, and it's just about, just get on with life, especially when there's no more suffering. Some of the teachings might just say, drop it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is definitely valuable to define your terms. It's so useful. Otherwise, people don't really know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Even if they think they do, they might not. So there's huge value to it, there is value actually in not defining terms, because it does allow the potential. And this is what I'm finding, and this is kind of how my expression is happening with the people who come to my meetings. It does allow a more intuitive connection with the teaching, whereas the problem with defining things is it can reinforce the ego and get too heady, get too intellectual, in a way that people can't let go of or see past. So there are advantages and disadvantages, right? What do I mean by identifying as a me? Essentially believing that you are limited to a body-mind. So you are the body-mind. You are a separate entity which has to be protected, which is subject to birth and death, suffering. And when that belief is let go of, there's still an appearance of a body-mind that needs to be protected, that's subject to birth, illness, death. But the identification with it, the belief that that's what you are, isn't necessarily in operation. It's just, that's all gone. You've just let go of all of that stuff.
You seem to be saying that that's something that happens, can be seen, because I'm sure lots of people in this room have seen through the sense of I, and they recognize I'm this beingness or stillness or emptiness, and I'm not. But that's a beginning of something rather than and there's a much deeper falling away of that sense.
Yeah. And this is the value. This is one of the values of the scriptures. And as I said, there are problems with the scriptures as well, because it can be quite intellectual and all this terminology and stuff. But the value of it is the scriptures point that out, time and time and again. And they say, look, yeah, it's an end of one aspect, because you've seen. I mean, it's a bit of an insult to say it's the beginning. It might have taken you 15 years to get there. It's, and then someone goes, no, it's just the beginning, You're just, and, it happens when you're a parent as well. If you're a parent and then, you've got a little child and they become one, you think, oh gosh, the hard part's all over. And someone else comes and goes, oh, it's just the beginning. Wait till you get a 2-year-old, and then wait till you get a 10-year-old, wait till they're 13. You've always got someone saying, you're just at the beginning. So it's not quite the beginning, but yeah, it's a part of the unfolding, and it's not the end.
Can I just put this into context, this beginning thing? There's such a broad range of teachings and seekers. When you look at seeking in its complete range, and we're often exposed to just the non-duality side of things, when you look at it in its complete range, and you see religion, which is a form of spiritual seeking and spirituality for sure, it is, and some of the beliefs that exist in religion, and even those that before even that, they're not even interested in anything other than something else. There's this massive range, and awakening, if this is the range, awakening could be considered to be here. But then if you say, okay, let's get, and then you have this, and awakening is sort of the beginning if you look at this section. But in a broader context, awakening, it's not like the beginning. That's big news.
Yeah, if you've been suffering loads, and then you get rid of 80%, 90% of your suffering, you're going to be feeling great. You're going to be feeling great, and you'll feel like you might not realize there's still 20% of you that's suffering, because you'll just feel great for like a year or two, and then that 20%, which you never had to look at before, starts to rear its head. So some of you might know, I'm a medical doctor by profession, and you see this when people have road traffic accidents. It's a bit different, but when they have road traffic accidents, people might have quite a serious injury, like they might have a really bad neck injury or a head injury, and then and they're thinking about it the whole time, and then they'll come in and see you a couple of weeks later and say, gosh, you know what, my foot is really hurting. But I never noticed. I didn't realise. I think I've done something really bad to my foot in that car crash, because I had all this pain up here. And now that pain up here is all gone, I'm noticing my foot's hurting. And, can you help me with my foot? And when I first came across this phenomena as a junior doctor, I was like, well, why didn't you tell someone about it? I was thinking to myself, why didn't you tell someone about it at the time? But you're not aware of it. So that's the great thing about the scriptures. Is that they have, especially, I know the Hindu scriptures and the Buddhist scriptures fairly well, and those two traditions, they're so complete, and they've got such a long tradition. It's not like it's a very well established path, and it points all this out in lots of detail. So that has value, because You know, it's great to get rid of 80% of your suffering, but what happens is that remaining 20% or that remaining 10% or that remaining 5% starts gnawing at you, you know? And there's nothing, and that's good, because that's what keeps you seeking, and that's what keeps you looking, and that's what keeps you engaging with the teachings. That's what enables the freedom to come. So we need to keep on being honest with ourselves. Are we still suffering? Are we still suffering? Because that's our driving force to keep us going forward on the path, and then heal ourselves.
In line with this, when the awakening happens and the suffering is still there, if we think it's about awakening, which often the teachings are, that's what they're trying to bring about, so that's their focus, is awakening, and then awakening happens and we think this is it, and the suffering isn't noticed. And so in the scriptures, there's a saying, don't mistake understanding for awakening, and don't mistake awakening for liberation. And when you look at that, understanding, awakening and liberation in the context, it fits very much in line with these steps that Tom was talking about. And it puts it that way because it is, in a way, a process. One thing leads to another, to the other. And so it makes it clear, awakening isn't liberation. Understanding is not awakening. The understanding would equate to the intellectual understanding and the process of starting to see what that's pointing to. Then the awakening happens, which is sort of a step out of the time-bound, out of the intellect into the timeless. And then it says, don't mistake that for liberation, because there's this process afterwards that is the process where the suffering that still exists because of the deeply ingrained vasanas, the awakening doesn't magically get rid of the deeply ingrained vasanas. It gives us the scope to shift into another place and remind ourselves of the core of who we are. But we keep getting dragged out because the vasanas are still in place. And so liberation relates to the point where those vasanas over time have been removed. The body has been purified, let's say. And the Zen sayings is, awakening is spontaneous, deliverance is gradual. And sometimes we might think, there are two different ways it can happen. We can have liberation through spontaneous awakening, or we can have liberation through gradual deliverance. In my interpretation, not saying that. It's saying awakening is spontaneous, and then there is a process that is gradual, which is deliverance. Deliverance of freedom from suffering.
That's made very clear in the Zen scriptures. You see that in all the Zen scriptures. They make that very, very clear.
You know, it's fascinating. You two guys talking about this, because I feel like I fell into being fascinated by satsang sort of 20 years ago, and in some ways it was like the Wild West. It's an amazingly creative thing that's emerging in the West, but perhaps wasn't as much clarity about the difference between awakening and liberation and what, all this kind of stuff, all this stuff you're talking about. It would have been handy in a way to have had perhaps this map 20 years ago.
Well, can I offer something regarding that map then? Is that because there is such a marketplace of spiritual teachings out there, when you hear a teaching, you can think to yourself, what kind of teaching is this? Is this an insight teaching? Is this saying that you don't need is this not emphasizing a still mind? Is this emphasizing a looking or a pointing out or a description of what's happening? And is it saying you don't really need to practice? That's like an insight style teaching. Or is it a purification style teaching where they're saying, no, you got to sit, you got to practice, it takes time, it's gradual. You got to put some effort into it. Every day you got to, notice or sit in meditation or do some chanting. So you can listen to different teachers from different traditions, and often you'll find that a teacher leans more towards one or the other, or is completely one or the other. And often you'll find in traditional teachings, purification teachers are quite easy to teach in a way, because you can say, yes, you sit down for an hour every morning, you concentrate on your breath, when feeling comes up, allow it to be felt. You can teach someone a purification technique. It's something that occurs within the waking dream, and it takes time, and is like a cause and effect, an apparent cause and effect that occurs. And you don't have to have any genuine realization or experience or anything to teach a purification teaching. So you'll find that often many, and this is not true of every traditional teaching, but you find often that traditional teachings will tend to concentrate on that. Because maybe, not always as I said, but maybe the teacher teaching it doesn't have any genuine insight, but they value the teachings, they want to share that. So you can read lots of texts on Buddhist scripture, not on Buddhist scripture, like you might read a Western Buddhist talk about Buddhism, and they'll emphasize the purification style teachings. You won't see an insight there. They won't really talk about how there's no one there and things are spontaneous and there's no self so much, perhaps. And on the other hand, you can get insight style teachers who don't maybe teach or recognize the importance of the purification aspect. And one of the limitations about the way I share this is that it's difficult to share both, because one takes time and one is kind of quite sudden. And one ends up in a real depth of silence and peace. And one doesn't necessarily. I think Roger does it quite successfully, by the way. One of the few people who does it quite successfully.
One of the reasons it's hard to talk about both in particular is that to create the awakening, often the methodology or the concepts that are delivered are aimed at shutting off certain functions of the brain that create the time spectrum, and they're there to reveal something that can exist when the brain is functioning, but at first it is only revealed when certain functions are shut down on the brain. And when you're talking about the purification process, you're talking about time and causality, and so this is why awakening teachings will say there is no process. You know, this is an illusion. It's shutting down certain functionings of the brain in order to create an experience which is still very likely an experience, what we would say a cognitive experience, because the brain isn't just responsible for thinking. Cognition isn't just thought. Everything you could say that functions through the brain is a form of cognition. And so this awakening, even though it's often said not to be of the body, from another perspective, it is, but it's happening because the brain apparatus is now not functioning the way it used to function. So if you're trying to do both, it's very hard, because on the one hand you're saying stop this type of functioning, and on the other hand you require that functioning to understand the causality concept. So I have a lot of faith that there's Nisargadatta's teaching, Ramana's teaching, Tony Parsons' teaching, Mooji's teaching, lots of teachings. Tom is focusing on this stillness more and more, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot of teachings, both traditional ones and present-day ones, that do that job, and then other teachings that do other jobs. And this is why I'm so putting so much emphasis on the fact that teachings dovetail in with each other and they support each other, and we don't need to worry as teachers so much about the process specifically, because this intelligence that is driving the spiritual will get people to go and resonate with what is needed at a particular time.
I think I want to make an observation. Shall I put it in there?
You have to switch it on as well.
I thought you were going to observe that we're 10 minutes over time.
I thought that's what he was going to say.
Time's up, folks. You just mentioned process. I think that there is that is key. I think that what you refer to as the insight teachings are saying kind of this is what is. And there's no room. The people that hear that and are happy with that, and that's fine. There's no room there for a process and to reflect on the process and what actually is going on, and the kind of shifts and the movements and I think to some extent there's a kind of dogma associated with that, because people don't recognize the individual at all. So therefore there can't be anything actually happening to the individual. And actually there is an apparent process.
You can even drop apparent as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I'm going to stick with the language that I'm using, but that's fine if you want to. If you want to edit,
no, it's fine.
Edit out
we'll bleep the word apparent like some kind of obscenity.
I think this is one moment where I know you can do apparent to death, but I'm. I think
because if you say apparent, it almost implies that it's
okay. Well,
it's pretend.
Well, let's unpack that in this context.
Mm-hmm.
In the appearance of this manifestation, you can look at it and say there's a process. But the key thing is that what you're acknowledging is that no one is doing that process. And you said that right at the beginning with the fact, Tom, you weren't here yesterday with your baby. The story of a baby being born. The baby isn't doing it itself. It's not making itself. Mm-hmm. It didn't bring itself into the world.
And it didn't grow itself.
It didn't grow itself. Mm-hmm. So, but that's a process. You can look at that, and as a medic, there's all kinds of processes, and and looking at it from all different angles, whether it's emotional, psychological, on any kind of level. So these appear. So I'm using the word apparent in the sense of this is what appears to be happening. And as a fan of Tony, and I've been following Tony for many years, I know that there's not much credence given to process, and in a sense, the way that message is delivered, it's not necessary. Mm-hmm. But then I think what the other point I wanted to make was that what I think has tremendous value listening to what you're saying is the broader access, the way that you're talking about it has, and essentially what you're talking about is the same thing. This suffering, what you say suffering is, the wording is totally different, but when you actually look at it and unpack what that actually means, it's exactly the same thing. Both are talking about separation, and that's what non-duality is. Mm-hmm. And that's it.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
You hit spot on. Is that if I were to use the definitions or the descriptions that I think describe it accurately, probably from a point after many phases, would say in practice. And this is why I don't say apparent, because there's process. And how do we know it's just apparent? How do we know that it isn't? Like it maybe process is. And so after a lot of stages, was actually there is a person. The liberating and game-changing insight is there is a person, but I am not the doer of what is happening through me. I am intrinsically one with life in that I'm never insulated from life, that I am an extrusion. Everyone else is an extrusion of life. It's like this, life is this wave, and we're always on the crest of the wave. We're never separate from that wave. We're an expression, we're an extrusion of life, never ever having been separate from it. And it's a psychological interpretation that creates a psychological separation, which never actually brings about separation of any of us from the one movement of life, which we've never been insulated from. And the recognition of non-doership recognizes that I've never been separate from life. I've never been the independent doer. I've always been lived by that movement of life. I am intrinsically an expression like everyone else of life. And so my competition and my rivalry and my anonymity between me and the other falls away because we stop seeing this psychological separation that has never really created an actual separation. And if we think that the non-separation is suddenly a change in experience where the experience of life is of oneness, which is what happens because we say we need an experiential understanding of this. The experiential understanding to me is the deep recognition I am not separate. It doesn't mean a oneness experience. The experiential understand drops the psychological separation, and on an experiential level, the duality remains. I feel separate from the other person. On an I don't feel like I am the other person. I feel like I am Roger. But attitudinally, there is no independent doers, so there's no separation attitudinally. So no guilt for my actions, no blame towards the other, no hatred and no shame. And these distinctions are not appropriate at some point in time. And at another point in time, they're so appropriate. Otherwise we go around with this expectation of what enlightenment looks like experientially. And it can be that we're waiting for a oneness experience that is very available as a peak experience, as a glimpse. And then when that happens, we think, oh, one day this will come and it'll stay forever. There's a very subtle version of that which we can always, when we drop into being, there is a subtle experience of oneness. Everything is arising within my consciousness. But what if we can say it's a consciousness of the individual, which is really a consciousness of life. And so then it becomes this paradox where I feel like I am the individual still separate on a daily life experience. So there's duality still on one level with a deep understanding of the non-dual. So it's like quantum physics and mechanical physics coexist. And you can't say that, oh, well, mechanical physics is just apparent and quantum physics is the real. The fact is they are both in the one manifestation. So they're both equally as real or as unreal as each other. And often we tend to want one. It's like, I am awareness. Oh yeah, and the body's here, but that's just apparent. It's like if the paradox comes together, we are, I am awareness. I am the body. With equal conviction, because they're not two. They both, in the end, come together. The human living a human experience is consciousness and the body as a single experience. And so, if we find ourselves preferring the notion I am consciousness, and we sort of acknowledge the body as just something. That's a psychological duality. I'm this and not that. And if we can exclaim, quantum physics is correct, quantum physics is real, mechanical physics is real, that's paradox. I am the human being. What is the human being? It's impersonal consciousness linked to a body, mind, organism, an instrument, a vehicle, and functions through that as personal consciousness. And the realization in the end, as far as I can see, is, I am a person, I'm just being lived. I'm not the doer. That's what really, in the end, for me, is what falls away. The ego remains. The ego is the person. Before, there was an ego with the strong belief of doership and attachment to outcome. Afterwards, the ego is still there. In this teaching, Ramana was an ego, Buddha was an ego, but without the belief in personal doership, without the belief in attachment to outcome, meaning a connection to the essence that's functioning through them.
Okay. Can I add something in?
I'm done.
You're done?
I'm done.
Yeah, I would actually phrase it slightly differently. In a way. So I hope I'm not confusing people by it, but I thought it might be interesting. Seeing as we're coming to the end of this, so we just maybe confusing, then I can go and then leave you to pick up the pieces tomorrow. So, so it's interesting because in the way I talk about it, there's no ego. There's no ego at all. But by ego, I mean the doer and the attachment to outcomes. So there's no ego at all. There's no one here, meaning there's no sense of doership or attachment to outcomes, because that's the essence of what a lot of us take ourselves to be. And then there's just an appearance. I like the word apparent, because there's an appearance of a body and an individual there relating with the world out there. But it's just an appearance that appears. Roger asked, how do you know that it's not real? And you don't. It could be, this is the way it is. But how do you know it's not an appearance? Which, it could be a dream. It could be this is all a dream, or we're all in a computer simulation. So the way the scriptures put it is quite nice. They say, ignorance is I am the body-mind. I am the body-mind. If you believe that thought, that's ignorance. Yeah. Then you use knowledge. Knowledge is I am consciousness. I'm pure consciousness, that which never changes, the light which illuminates everything, that is one with everything, that is intimate with everything, but fundamentally untouched by everything. This pure consciousness notion. So what the seeker does, the seeker's ignorant, they believe they're the body-mind. The teaching says, take on a new belief, I am consciousness, to remove the old belief, I am the body-mind. So you take on this new belief, I am conscious, you practice that. This is one of the ways the traditional teachings work. And you say, I'm conscious. Every time you identify as the body-mind, you go, no. I've just caught myself identifying as the body-mind. I'm not the body-mind, I'm untouched by life, I'm pure consciousness. I'm allowing myself to feel everything, but in the essence, I'm untouched and I'm unharmed. Yeah? And then eventually, you remove the habitual tendency to identify as the body-mind. And then when that habitual tendency to identify as body-mind, ignorance, suffering, has gone, because ignorance causes suffering then goes, and then you lose the interest to identify as consciousness. And you'll see in the higher sort of scriptures, in things like, what's it called? I've forgotten. Things like Ashtavakra Gita, and there's another one, Avaduta Gita, Song of the Free, Avaduta Gita, then they say, why am I saying I am Brahman? I'm free. I don't have to say I am Brahman. Why am I, so they're getting rid of the entire teaching, even the I am Brahman, I am the absolute type teachings. That slips away. And then what's left is just what's happening. Free of identification as a person. Now the body-mind appears and uses, and like this body-mind calls itself, responds to the name Tom most of the time and will interact with people as if they're real, but it's all an appearance. But there's not a belief that this is real, nor is there a belief that I am consciousness. There's just the absence of the belief, I am a person. So you don't have to have two vantage points of I am consciousness, I am a person. But yet, these concepts will appear and be used and manifest. One example I often use that may clarify it is that of the oceans of the world. Because if you look at the oceans of the world, when I was a child and I was taught about different oceans like the Pacific Ocean and the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, I was always really confused. I didn't understand what all these different oceans were, because all I could see was one body of water. Okay? So we don't have to believe that there is no Indian Ocean and there's no Pacific Ocean. You can use these terms knowing that they refer to different aspects of a whole and realize they're useful in some situations, but you don't have to believe that there's separate oceans out there. And maybe you could sort of transfer that analogy to like the belief in identity. You don't have to identify as a body-mind. So you can say that there's an appearance of a person. I like that, because there is an appearance of a person. Is there definitely a person? Well, who can say? Is it definitely not a person? Well, who can say? Do you give a fuck?
Would you agree? I found at some point, I said, well, let's say it could well be a dream. You can't argue that. If this was a dream in consciousness, this is what it would be experienced like if it was constructed to be this sort of dream. Or we'd say, well, actually, I don't know that for sure, because if this was an objective reality, this is what it would be experienced as also. And at some point I went, but in practical terms, this is where in practical terms is so important. I have to live my life as a human being in this world, and if I drop a chair on my head, practically speaking, the chair is real. So without it disturbing everything that happened before, I said, I don't know one or the other, but I do know that in practical terms, it's all real. So I said, actually, I'm going to stick with as it appears in practice. Where this becomes really confusing is that for some people at a particular stage, when the beliefs that it is all one, I am consciousness, are really strong, the experience, the actual experience of life is affected by the beliefs, because they do actually shut down certain faculties of the brain, and the experience is one of oneness. And so when I talk about, in practical terms, there is separation, in practical terms, someone will say, no, there isn't. My experience is there is no separation. I understand it. I was there. Thank God for Ramesh in my experience. I didn't realize that the beliefs that I didn't see were beliefs were actually influencing the nature of the experience. At a certain point when I dropped beliefs because of what was said, the oneness experience is stopped. The suffering didn't come back, but the oneness experience is, and I realized, wow, these certain ways of seeing life and feeling oneself are influenced by the beliefs in the system. So it was only when a belief I held that I didn't see was seen as a belief and it dropped. And then the experience changed. The suffering didn't come back. So I realized, oh, suffering isn't because I am oneness, or I am... And then the experience was, in practical terms, the world is real. So I said, I'm going to run with that. Not as a belief, because I don't believe that the world is real. I know it might not be real, but I don't believe it's not real. So that's why I stopped using apparent. But it's not an attack on the use of the word apparent. It's like, I come to, in practice, I said, that's not an apparent chair or an apparent person. It is from a certain perspective. But when my brain stops doing all of that practice and seeking and repeating of concepts, which is a deepening phase, then I realize even this notion, it's apparent, is unnecessary. Just descriptions of how I experience the process changing. I guess, unless you have a closing comment.
Let's have like another. No.
You can have the last word.
Okay. I'll have the last word. Why don't we just be in silence for a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for welcoming me here. Thanks for allowing me to intrude. Thanks, Roger.
It's been a pleasure. We should do it again.
I'd very much like to. But we could go now. We could carry on.
Yes.
Actually, can I plug my meetings?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested, I hold meetings every Thursday. And twice a month I do online meetings. So the first Thursday of the month, we've got a Facebook Live. The second Thursday of the month, we meet at the Druids Head Pub in Kingston upon Thames. The third Thursday of every month, we do an online meeting on Zoom, which is a bit like Skype. And the fourth, and back at the Druids Head. So we alternate between online and in person. And the meetings are free, and donations are accepted. But please do come along if you feel like you want to. If you want to know more details, I've got a website, tomdas.com, and I've also got a meetup website. If you type in Tom Das Meetup on Google, you'll see a link to where all the events are. So do feel free to come along if you want to. And thank you again. Mm-hmm.